Welcome to Sunday Night Discussions. Joining us tonight from Houston, Texas, my friend and your host, Steve Hinton. I'm your co-host, Robert Tippett. Here in Austin, Texas, we're especially glad that you could join us this evening for our discussions. This evening, we're graced by the presence of Dr. Terry Bowland, professor of New Testament Studies at Ozark Christian College in Joplin, Missouri. Ozark just happens to be Steve's alma mater. Can you believe that? He went to college there. Oh, yes, and so did I. We both graduated from there with a similar degree, bachelor's in theology, and tonight it's kind of like going home, I guess, going back to school there, Steve. We will be looking tonight at the authenticity of the Bible and the validity of Christ in our conversations. We've covered both of these topics in the past, and they just seem to be topics that you can't discuss enough about. So we're going to discuss it a little further again this evening. We're so glad you could join us for show number 25. Steve, can you believe it? We are actually on show number 25. Unbelievable.
You know, that's interesting, Robert. I didn't realize that until right now, and I think you're absolutely correct. I mean, we ought to, have a party or something
big
here.
Celebration, yeah, big celebration.
Well, what is that called, like the bronze anniversary or something like that? I'm not up on...
I'm not. He's silver or something. I don't know. I've been married 26 years. I still don't know. So
that's right. 25 episodes, and you are correct. Number one, welcome everybody. Thank you for being here tonight. I know you could be watching The Walking Dead, but you chose to be with us, which is better. And Robert, I found out even if you're not recording it, they play it again. At 10 o'clock.
They do. They play it 2 hours later. That's correct.
Yeah, so what is going to happen? I'm going to catch up with my second son, and we're going to go over to somebody's house at 10 o'clock and watch that. And he's a senior in high school, so, he could stay up late.
I did enjoy last week's episode. It was a nice start to the season.
I got to be honest, when it was done and over with, and I've not seen all of them, but when it was done and over with, my thought was, well, at least Tyrese finally took that hat off.
Okay. Well, we're not dead here. We are definitely alive, and hopefully our audience is as well. And just want to reach out and say thanks to everybody who participated last week. We had several folks give feedback to last week's show, and it was great. And it was great to hear from you all and to see you involved. And with that said, I want to encourage our audience to feel like take on the opportunity to see this as their own show. Steve and I have been doing this on and off for a couple years now. We're 25 episodes in, and pretty much just about everything we do, with the exception of the things we do with our guests, Steve and I both are tackling together. And the truth of the matter is we both have day jobs. Steve pastors a church in Houston, and I work for a computer company here in North Austin, and we both have busy lives, but we enjoy doing the show. We love doing the show, but there's some things we'd like to do with the show that we just don't have the time to do. And what we'd like to do is encourage our audience members who really want to be a part of what we do here in the show to think of themselves as co-producers and come on and help us with that. We have a little logo. You can see, I think it's down right, yeah, there it is at the bottom of the screen. That logo I threw together in about an hour and a half one afternoon, and it's okay. It's not bad.
I like it, but we need to do something with the bridge behind your head, though. Tell us about that.
Oh, the Pennybacker Bridge in Austin, Texas, the Highway 360 going over Lake Austin there. Yes. And you're right, we do need to do something about that. And here's what I'm wanting to propose. If we've got a graphic artist out there who wants to throw some logo designs together for us and help us out with the logo, we would be excited to have you be a part of that. As soon as we get a decent logo, I'm going to print a big one and put it here behind me and get rid of the Pennybacker Bridge behind me here in the back. We've got some other things. There's some things you can do to help us with writing up notes from the shows, helping us put together programs in the future as far as scheduling and getting guests on. So if you think you'd like to be involved with that, hop over to our Google Plus page, drop us a note, send us a line, let us know how you'd like to help us with the show, and we'd like to get you involved. We really would.
And as always, we welcome your questions during the show, and you can do that if you're watching tonight through Google Plus. Type in the questions there. Also, if you go to my blog, kingdomology.com, you can type in questions there, or our Facebook pages, either our personal pages or we also have a Sunday night discussion page as well. Now, with that, for our topic tonight, we're going to kind of come back to what is maybe the bread and butter of why Robert and I have been doing this, that we realize that there are some very legitimate questions out there in the world that we care about, and we want to do that. We want to address those questions. One of those primary questions is the Bible. Can we trust it? Is it worthy? What's the difference between that and the Quran or anything else? What about the fact that, Christians say, hey, this was written 2,000 years ago? Well, that was a long time ago. How can you trust it? That's kind of the direction that we want to go tonight, the topic we want to tackle tonight. And with that, we have a special guest on. Robert has already mentioned Dr. Bowland. So I want to throw that over to you, Robert, to introduce our primary guest tonight.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, Steve and I both attended Ozark Christian College, both graduated from there with our bachelor's degrees, and Terry Bowland is a professor there of New Testament studies, and Terry's been there 20 years now, did you say, Terry? You've been here
20,
now? Yeah,
22 years.
22 years at Ozark Christian College. And Terry joins us tonight from his office there on campus, and we're glad to have him. And glad you're here. Terry, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Well, I've been here at Ozark for 22 years, teaching New Testament. I teach evangelism and some other topics on campus. This summer I'll celebrate my 40th wedding anniversary, which is amazing.
Wow.
My wife needs a big award for that, staying married to me for 40 years. I've got a couple of daughters. They're both married. One, she and her hubby live in Nashville, and they have two grandchildren for us. And I have another daughter and her hubby live in Detroit, in the Detroit area. And they have one grandchild.
Okay.
And I think they're working on a second.
Great. Well, we're so glad that you're able to join us tonight and especially take on this topic.
Glad to be able to do it.
Now, Terry, you actually came, I think, my senior year at Ozark. So I never really spoke with you or knew you. I believe that I went to a convention one time where you gave a theology workshop, which I thought was pretty interesting. So being honest, I mean, I knew you. I kind of knew the thumbnail sketch of everything, but I didn't know some of the details till I went to your bio. And on a somewhat of a fun note, something said that you were into powerlifting. What's that all about?
Yeah, that's one of my bad habits. I started going to the gym years ago and just to work out, and some of the guys there said, "Hey, for a little older guy, you're not too bad. You should enter into a few contests." So I actually, over the past 10 years, have done that. I've discovered the older you get and the lighter you get, you become more competitive in powerlifting. So I don't lift what the big giant guys do, but compared to other 60-year-old fellows like myself, I guess I do okay.
So is that for your classes when you say, okay, hey, I want this 50-page paper turned in by Thursday, and if you don't get it done, I'm going to bonk you on the head? Does that help out a little bit?
No, not too much. I'm not too much of an imposing figure.
Well, we want to know what you have to say tonight. Maybe to kind of kick this ball off, there was an article that came out, I don't know, about a month, maybe 2 months ago in Newsweek. And being honest, I see articles like this all the time, and I just didn't read it. But the whole gist of the article was one of, okay, here are reasons why the author believes and wants you, the world, to believe that the Bible is bunk and you're a flat earther to believe it, and let's move on to reality. What sort of questions like that are out there, Terry? What kind of questions do in addition to that, do you hear, do your students hear, do your students have that are out there in the world today when it comes to the subject of the Bible?
Well, in reference to the Newsweek article, I thought it was an extremely unfortunate article. Most of our sophomores could answer the intellectual questions posed by the author of that particular article. To begin with, when you begin looking at the Bible, probably the first question would be, can we be sure that what we have in front of us in the Bible is actually what was written 2,000 years ago, in the case of the New Testament, clear back to 3,500 years ago, as far as some of the older Old Testament books are concerned. After all, you've probably all played that little game of telephone where you whisper a sentence in somebody's ear in the room, and the sentence gets passed around the room, and by the time it gets to the last guy, the sentence has nothing to do with the original. And some people try to do that with the Bible. In fact, this Newsweek article actually used that sort of argumentation, that because the Bible has been translated and retranslated and passed down through 2,000 plus years, how could we even know what it says is actually what was originally written? And the answer to that is because we have tremendous amount of evidence. We don't have oral tradition for 2,000 years. We have actual copies extant of the Old Testament scriptures. We'll just start with the Old Testament. We have handwritten manuscripts that date back to about 1000 A.D. And when we compare those with our present Old Testaments, there is no variation whatsoever. We go back, and of course, the oldest extant manuscript of the entire Old Testament is about 930 A.D., but that's still quite a ways removed from the Old Testament period, which would go from about 1500 to 400 B.C. So how can we tell that there weren't any mistakes made in that gap between 900 A.D. and, say, 400 B.C.? We know a little bit about the people that copied the Old Testament back in that era. From about 500 to 900 A.D., there were a group of scribes called the Masoretes, and from about 200 to 500 A.D., there were a group of scholars, Jewish scholars, called the Talmudic scholars.
Right.
And we know a little bit about their copying techniques. We know that they would only write so many words on a page. Each manuscript page was checked over after they finished each page. If the page contained more than 3 mistakes that had been corrected, they corrected the mistakes, but if it contained more than 3 mistakes that had been corrected, they threw the page out and started over again. The Jewish scribes counted the number of letters in every book. They could tell you the middle letter of every book. They counted the number of words in every book. They counted the middle word in every book. And so after the whole book was done, they would simply count up all the letters in the book. If the right number of letters didn't come out, they knew there was a mistake somewhere. They'd go back and find it. And so that gets us back to within a couple of hundred years of Jesus. In 1948, 47, 48, there was a major discovery that was probably one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in the 20th century. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
See, I was going to ask about that. I was going to ask about that.
We didn't find whole copies of the Old Testament in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it's really crazy. A little Bedouin shepherd boy's out taking care of his flock, and he's throwing rocks up into the cave holes. Yeah, and he's throwing rocks, and he throws one rock. It goes through one of the holes, and he hears pottery breaking. And that intrigues him, and so he climbs up and he finds a cache of old clay pots with ancient manuscripts inside. It's like something out of an Indiana Jones movie. And to make a long story short, eventually some archaeologists were led to that site, and they discovered a large number of manuscripts. Probably the most important biblically is an entire copy of the book of Isaiah that dates to about 100 B.C.
Okay.
And so it's 1,000
that's
years
that's
earlier.
B.C.
B.C. before Christ. It dates 1,000 years earlier than the previous oldest manuscript. And so when we compare that manuscript from the Dead Sea Scrolls with the with the 1000 AD manuscripts, what do we find? We find that almost no variation in the manuscripts. Let me give you an example. A famous chapter in Isaiah is Isaiah 53 that talks about
Right.
the prophecy of the coming of Christ.
Right.
There are about 160. Let me. Yeah, 166 words in Hebrew words in Isaiah 53. Out of those 166 words, there are 17 letters that are variations between the Dead Sea Scroll manuscript and the next oldest manuscript, and all but 3 of those letters are spelling variations. You know, spelling of words changes through the years. Old English spells color C-O-L-O-U-R, and we spell it C-O-L-O-R. And
unless you're British, and the British say we're wrong on that one.
That's true. That's true. But anyway, after 1,000 years, there's only 3 letters which constitute one Hebrew word that was missing from the older manuscript, and it was the word light. The people have seen the coming of the Lord. In one of the manuscripts it said they've seen a great light. It really makes no difference in the meaning of the text. And so basically we have 1,000 years of copying, and we're convinced that the scribes did their job. So what we have in front of us today, as far as the Old Testament's concerned, we can be absolutely assured is what was originally written.
Now,
go ahead.
Well, I was about to say, on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I'm sure Robert and I would be excluded from this type of journey, but maybe you. But from my understanding, it's possible to actually go to Israel today in one of their museums or whatever to pull up those. I guess they've got them in these coolers or whatever.
Yes,
whatever.
they do.
But you can find those scrolls today.
Oh yeah. They're all the manuscripts, even the ones I was talking about that are 1,000 years old, are in museums scattered around the world. That's the great thing about the Christian faith, is that Christian scholars, we lay all of the manuscripts out for the scholarly world, Christian and non-Christian, to take a look at. We're not trying to hide anything. I don't see too many scholars in some of the other faiths doing that with some of their ancient manuscripts. I don't want to.
You're going to pick any of them out specifically.
Yeah. I don't see too many early Islamic scholars trotting out the oldest manuscripts of the Quran for the population to see. They just tell us to trust us on these things, and so I'm not. If they say trust them, I'll trust them. But Christians have always laid the manuscripts out for everyone to see. And when you move to the New Testament, oh my goodness, the evidence is overwhelming. For instance, we have whole copies of the New Testament that date within a couple of hundred years of the final books of the New Testament being written. The New Testament was written probably between about 45 AD to about 95 AD, so a period of about 50 years. We have a fragment of John's Gospel, the John Rylands Papyrus, that was discovered in Egypt. That is a small section of the 18th chapter of John's Gospel, and it dates to within 30 years of when John wrote the original manuscript of the Gospel. And the crazy thing is that John, we're pretty sure, wrote the Gospel of John while he was in the western part of what we would call the country of Turkey today. It was the Roman region of Asia Minor back then. But the manuscript was found in Egypt. And so what does that tell us? That within a generation of John finishing his Gospel, it's being widely circulated throughout the Mediterranean world, so that a copy shows up in Egypt. That fragment, the John Rylands Papyrus, may have been a manuscript copied from the original manuscript written by John himself. That's how early it is. And of course, when we look at the manuscripts of the New Testament, we have 5,000 plus Greek manuscripts. And a manuscript is a handwritten copy, copies of the New Testament written before the invention of the printing press. We have over 10,000 ancient Latin versions of the New Testament. The New Testament was originally written in Greek. It's translated into Latin because that was the legal language of the Roman Empire. And we have over 9,000 other ancient versions. The New Testament was widely translated into many different languages in the ancient world. And so we have 24,000 plus manuscripts of the New Testament. And so when we it's very easy to take our current New Testament, lay it out with the thousands upon thousands of manuscripts of the New Testament, some dating within a generation of the writing of the New Testament itself, and we see no appreciable variation in the manuscripts.
Right.
And so when we open our New Testament, what you're seeing is what Peter wrote, it's what Matthew wrote, it's what John wrote.
Right, and it's interesting as I look at the little article we got here, the quotes from David Cross. Now, mind you, David's a comedic actor, so part of what he was doing there was a comedy routine that he's being quoted on. But they're taking that idea that has been taught in schools about the Bible, that some people have actually written books about and actually believe this type of idea that David Cross is joking about. And it wasn't a telephone game. It was, if you took the telephone game and you wrote it down on a sheet of paper and you passed a sheet of paper around, you would end up with the same sheet of paper at the other end of the telephone game.
That
it would
is
still say what was written on it. So
that's absolutely correct. And you could go back and check the pieces of paper from the people 2 or 3 individuals removed from the original.
That's
because
right.
they still exist as well.
Now, Terry, to kind of put things in context, because what you're saying to the world here, and just kind of reviewing what you're saying, is that we could go, and particularly we're talking about the New Testament, which was written in Greek, and we can go back and find these manuscripts that were written in such and such date, close to the proximity of the original account, and there's this huge number. In comparison, let's look at some of the ancient documents that the educated world accepts.
I've got some figures on some of those in front of me.
Right.
For instance,
Caesar's Wars.
Caesar's Gallic Wars, that was written while he was on campaign in what would today be France. It was written sometime before Caesar's death in 44 BC. The earliest copy we have of Caesar's Gallic War is 1,000 years removed from when he originally wrote it. We have a manuscript of Caesar's Gallic War around 900 A.D. And if you added up all the ancient handwritten manuscripts we have of Caesar's Gallic War, we have a whopping 10.
Wow.
Okay.
10 in existence. For instance, Plato, I teach philosophy here as well, and we've just gotten through plodding through the ancient Greeks. Plato wrote a philosophical work. The Tetralogy is one of his more famous works. He wrote around, in somewhere between 427 and 347 BC. The earliest copy we have of that work by Plato dates 900 A.D. That's 1,300 years removed from when Plato wrote.
Plato actually wrote it.
Yeah, we have 7 whopping manuscripts.
Right.
7. And we can go through the rest of the ancient world. We have 8 manuscripts of Thucydides' Greek history that almost all the history books about the ancient Greeks are taken from. The earliest manuscript is 1,300 years removed from when Thucydides wrote. The best attested work in the ancient world outside of the Bible is Homer's Iliad.
Right. That's right.
That's right.
And see, kids in elementary school
are taught
hear
this.
about Homer's Iliad.
Yeah, and Homer wrote the Iliad around 900 BC. Homeric scholars argue about that, but we'll just say 900 BC. We actually have a copy. We have a manuscript, a partial manuscript of Homer's Iliad that dates to 400 BC. But that's still 500 years removed from when it was originally written. If you added up all the manuscripts we have of Homer, Many of them date to the early medieval period. We have 643.
Compared to what you said, 24,000.
24,000 manuscripts of the Bible. The next best attested piece of ancient literature is Homer's Iliad, and it only has 643 manuscripts.
Right.
But most of the ancient texts have fewer than a dozen known existing manuscripts, almost all of them dating 1,000 years removed.
Right.
And here's our New Testament with sections of the New Testament, the manuscript evidence dating within a lifetime of when the original authors wrote.
So
and
you're
so
talking
there's
about...
really no comparison.
Yeah, so you're talking not only about, a manuscript, for example, the manuscript of the Gospel of John, but then you're also talking about a number of fragments like the John Ryland that is, what was the date on that, 95 A.D.?
Well, John Ryland's dates, John didn't finish his Gospel probably until the early 90s A.D. is best scholarly guess. John Ryland's, most of the dates you'll see for that from scholars, and this includes non-Christian scholars, date it from around 125 to 130 A.D. So 25 to 30 years removed from the actual dating.
If I remember correctly, and let me be clear, there's the Gospel of John, then there's this British guy by the name of John Ryland who found the papyrus, and you can go to... I don't know which museum, but someplace in England.
It's in Ireland, actually.
Oh, in Ireland. Okay.
Yeah. In fact, a good friend of mine, Mark Moore.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Mark, a good friend of mine, used to be on faculty here, actually got in to see the John Ryland's papyrus. Yes.
Yeah, nice.
He had to promise the guard that he'd give him a kiss if he'd let him in. Although the guard did not accept the kiss, but Mark told him he'd kiss him if he'd let him see that fragment of the New Testament. So the guard let him in, and to actually, of course, he couldn't touch it, but it's under the glass. He actually got to see that.
Well, and Terry, it's interesting. One of the comments you made a little bit ago was about how Christians kind of lay out their document, its history. It's all out there for the public to go consume.
That's absolutely correct.
Hidden behind closed doors. And I even find that even in our modern versions, I always love to discuss with people John's Gospel, where we have the story of the woman caught in adultery there.
Correct.
And every modern version is very clear about the historicity of this text, and paints a very clear picture of what we know about that part of the text and how it is different, and we don't find it in early manuscripts.
Yeah.
And what that possibly means. Not necessarily that John didn't write it, but that it probably wasn't here.
It's the earliest known manuscript that contains the story of the woman at the well is not until the 11th century A.D. And it begins to show up in a few manuscripts.
Which isn't to say it's not a true story.
That's correct. It probably wasn't a part of the original Gospel of John.
That's right.
It actually shows up in some ancient manuscripts in different places other than at the beginning of the 8th chapter of John. There's even a manuscript of Luke's Gospel it shows up in.
Right.
So probably what happened is that's an authentic story of Jesus' life that was handed down through oral tradition for years and years and years, which was very well known in the time of the ancient world because the printing press hadn't been invented, and so many stories were just passed on orally. That became written and finally included in that particular spot in John's Gospel. But when you pull out a copy of the New Testament, there is a double bracket.
Right. It makes
that.
Real clear about this
yes, it does.
We're not hiding anything here on that.
And down at the bottom it says, not found in the oldest manuscripts of the New Testament.
Right.
And nobody's trying to hide that. Nobody's making excuses for it. We want to admit what we admit. In fact, most of the ancient manuscripts of the New Testament in particular are not housed in Christian universities. They're housed in secular libraries, and they are administrated by secular officials.
Right.
I think that's a good point. And I like how, Terry, you've hit on this, and Robert, you've hit on this, that when you take the Bible and you put it up against, say, the Book of Mormon, for example, that the Mormon church is very, very close, or close-lipped, or tight, or whatever, as to being able to produce, here's why we can know Joseph Smith wasn't just making this up. Well, they don't offer anything. They don't offer anything in the archaeological realm, and maybe I'd throw that out as a question as well. When we go beyond just the manuscript, what kind of pieces do we have in the world today in the archaeological science to prove or disprove the Bible?
Well, archaeology over and over and over again has verified the general historicity of the biblical witness. Now, scholars are still debating about, did the Exodus take place, but of course secular scholars don't want to admit that because it would require the belief in a miracle and God calling the people out of Egypt. But there's quite a few pieces. There's a stela found in the Arabian Peninsula that highlighted one of Pharaoh's victories over the Hebrew wanderers that was fought in a skirmish while they had escaped. Well, my lands, there they are, mentioned in Egyptian history. Let me give you an example from the New Testament. There was a scholar at the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, who was commissioned by Cambridge University to travel to the ancient Near East and go on archaeological digs. And his thesis was he wanted to disprove the historical nature of the writings of the Book of Acts. He wanted to prove that it could not have been written by eyewitnesses, that it was written several generations after the events had taken place, and it was basically a fabrication by the early church to give validity to their own existence. What this scholar discovered was, once he got over to the country of Turkey today, and he began to retrace the missionary journeys of the Apostle Paul, he discovered that all of the cities that Luke mentions that Paul visits were there. The main Roman roadways, the ruins of the Roman roads between the cities were there. Yeah. And this individual not only concluded that the Book of Acts was substantial history, he concluded the Book of Acts was one of the finest historical books in the entire ancient world. And then he made a second conclusion. He concluded that if Luke, he concluded that whoever wrote the Book of Acts had to be an eyewitness to the events occurring. Right. And he concluded, if Luke is right about all of the minor details, the small details about the cities, the roads, the places, could he be wrong about the main detail, that Jesus was risen from the dead? And he ended up yielding up his life in faith to Christ, and accepted Christ as Lord and Savior. In fact, I've got my brain is it's Sunday night and I'm in an ice storm. My brain's looking out of me. I can see a 10-volume set of his complete works on my shelf up here. If I had a second, I'd go up there and give you his name, which for some reason escapes me right at the moment.
That kind of gets to the crux of this discussion, though, don't you think? I mean, when almost any individual I've ever run into who has taken the time to look at the evidence and not just hearsay or throw their opinion or get behind somebody else's opinion, but has actually gone and done their own homework, as I like to say, that they inevitably end up in this place where they're like, this must be true, and they've got it. I mean, that's Josh McDowell's story. Right. There's story after story of people.
Lee Strobel's story we'll tell here in a little while.
Right.
Yeah, it's now, of course, not everyone becomes a believer.
Sure.
But especially in the case of the New Testament, even non-believers recognize the existence of Jesus of Nazareth and the historical nature of his person. Even secular scholars admit that. In fact, I've got a little book here written by a fellow by the name of Bart Ehrman, who is no friend to the Christian faith. He's an expert, a secular expert in New Testament literature, but he is not a believer in Jesus. And he wrote a little book entitled, Did Jesus Exist?
Right.
The historical argument for Jesus of Nazareth, and he concludes, whether we like it or not.
He did exist.
Yes, and
Well,
and we have to deal with the material that comes to us.
and you know, it's funny because I think this sets us up for the second part of our conversation, Steve. But I'm trying to remember which professor it was I was under who said to me, "You asked me how I know he lives because of the historicity of the Bible, which documents his resurrection."
Right, because there's an old hymn.
Yeah, he lives within my heart.
Yeah. I think that was Paul Butler who said that. But I think
professor just like that.
Oh, I bet you did.
Yeah, he made us change the words. You asked me how I know he lives. We had to sing "The Bible Tells Me So."
That's right.
Well, I think you're right, Robert. Why don't we transition here a little bit past halftime in the game, but looking specifically at Jesus Christ. What are the claims of Jesus, and then are they right or wrong? I think the big claim out there is that he is the Son of God, he is divine, and it's interesting. Here I am in Houston. The very first time I was in Houston, I was with a group of college students and a guy named Steve Sigler that you guys may know, and Steve's kind of, he's got a warped sense of humor, and we found a psychic that we were listening to on the radio, and some guy was asking these bizarre questions, and then somebody asked about Jesus, and she said, well, I believe Jesus was this and this, but he wasn't God. And I thought that was interesting because the person did not ask, is Jesus God? She just offered that he's not God. So where does that come from? What are the claims? Was he merely a man like Muhammad or anyone else, or was there more? What are the claims from the New Testament, and then can we trust those claims?
Yeah, and of course, since we've verified the fact that we can trust the text of the New Testament as well as the Old Testament to be what was actually written concerning these events, then we have to ask ourselves the question, what did Jesus claim about himself? It's so popular in today's world to want to accept Jesus as a great moral authority, the foundation of Western morality, that he was a great teacher of ethics, a very good man that we should emulate. But they don't nail you to a cross by being a good man,
a good guy,
or a moral teacher. He made some absolutely amazing claims. In fact, when you go through the New Testament to see what Jesus claimed about himself, he claimed divinity at his trial. He was asked in Mark the 14th chapter when he was on trial, the high priest said, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus said, "I am," which was particularly powerful for a Jewish audience because I am, in addition, is the name of God. If you remember watching the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, and Charlton says, well, who do I say sends me? And what does God say? I am that I am. Tell them I am sent you. So Jesus numerous times during the gospel used that emphatic I am to reference himself as God, and then he went on to say, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One coming on the clouds of heaven. Right. And the high priest tore his clothes and said, hey, we don't need to pay any more false witnesses. We've heard it. We've heard it from his own mouth. And of course, Jesus didn't say, oh, no, you misunderstand.
No.
No, he accepted it. He claimed that if you'd seen him, you'd seen the Father. He claimed that to know him was to know the Father. He claimed that people should believe in him. Don't let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me, Jesus said. So and one of the biggest issues is that Jesus accepts worship.
Right.
Yeah.
Jesus accepts worship. In Matthew 8:27, it's very interesting. Jesus is on the Sea of Galilee a couple of times with his disciples. In Matthew 8, he calms the storm, and this is early in his ministry with his disciples, and the disciples at the end of that say, "Who is this man, that even the winds and the waves obey him?" But later on, in Matthew 14, after they've gone through several years of ministry together, Jesus saves Peter from the storm, if you remember that story, and when they get back in the boat, the storm is calmed, and by that time, the disciples have discovered who Jesus is, and the text says, those who were in the boat worshipped him and said, "Truly, you are the Son of God." And Jesus receives the worship. Now, the biggest law...
What do you do with that?
Yeah, the biggest law of the Hebrews was, you shall worship the Lord your God only.
Right.
And serve him only. And so, for anyone to say that they accept Jesus as a great teacher or a great moralist, well, he couldn't have been that, and we'd have to go... One of the best arguments to show the silliness of only accepting Jesus as a teacher or a moralist comes from C.S. Lewis. And you guys
I was going to ask about him.
You guys were familiar with his... he called it the trilemma. Josh McDowell calls it the trilemma. Can I quote for you about 3 or 4 sentences from C.S. Lewis?
Yeah. You're the boss. You can do what you want to do.
Yeah, in his book, Mere Christianity, says, "I'm trying here to prevent anyone from saying the really foolish thing that people often say about Jesus, that they're ready to accept Jesus as a moral teacher, but they don't accept his claims to be God." C.S. Lewis wrote, "This is the one thing that we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things that Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level of a man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make a choice." And here's what C.S. Lewis wrote: "Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else he's a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, or you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord. But let us not come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us."
Yeah, as Paul would be fond of saying, do not let yourselves be deceived.
Yeah.
You know, you mentioned that you've been teaching philosophy recently, and apparently you got your master's in philosophy.
Yeah.
And we like to joke around here that I'm a Willardite. A Willardite. I'm sure Dallas Willard is rolling over in his grave just to hear that.
There you go.
But you know, one of the things that I often, I try to flip this coin a little bit on believers, because I think sometimes we don't pay enough attention to, if he really was a son of God, then that does make him the smartest man who's ever walked the face of the earth. So now all of a sudden what he's telling you, there's something that we probably ought to be paying attention to at the same time.
That is absolutely correct. And so Jesus made these claims to divinity.
Right.
And so the question comes then, why do we believe the claims? We know that is what the early church wrote about what Jesus said and did. They were eyewitnesses that wrote it. Why did they believe the claims of Jesus, and why have 2,000 years of followers of Christ believe those claims? When the early Christians preached about Jesus, they usually had 2 main forms of evidence. The first evidence was fulfilled prophecy. There are all these prophecies in the Old Testament written hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 years before the coming of Christ, that specifically mentions a Messiah coming into Israel, and very specific things about who he would be, where he would be from, what he would do. There are scores of specific prophecies and hundreds of prophetic allusions. The apostles preached that Jesus uniquely and completely fulfills every last one of those prophecies.
Right.
Now, and that's tremendous. And they're not prophecies. I don't know if you've ever looked at some of the prophecies of Nostradamus or some of these other guys that
but you hear them every now and then.
Yeah, I'd challenge anyone to take a look at some of the prophecies, supposed prophecies of somebody like Nostradamus. They are so vague. They are so obscure that the prophecy could mean almost anything. Compare that to the prophecies concerning the coming of Christ. Where is he to be born? He's to be born in Bethlehem.
Right.
How is he to die? He's going to see his hands and feet pierced, according to the psalmist. They are going to gamble for his clothing at the time of his crucifixion. He's going to be with a rich man his death is going to be with the wicked, and yet he's going to be with a rich man in his death. He's crucified between thieves, and yet he's buried in the tomb of a very wealthy member of the Jewish High Council who had secretly become a believer, Joseph of Arimathea. All these prophecies that are extremely specific. And they're all uniquely, completely fulfilled in the life of one and only one man, and that's Jesus of Nazareth. I've got some statistics here.
Isn't it something like over 300 prophecies of the coming of Christ?
If you count the prophetic allusions, like many of the aspects of the tabernacle worship in the Old Testament were prophetic imageries of Christ. So there are really hundreds. There are several great books concerning Old Testament prophecy, and to tell you how many there are, they're all great, huge books. I've got 3 of them on my shelf behind me. The most scholarly one is by a scholar by the name of Van Groningen, Messianic Revelation in the Old Testament. It runs 800 pages of studying the prophecies of the Old Testament in regard to the coming of Christ. Now the issue is, what are the odds of all of these prophecies being uniquely and completely fulfilled in just one person? Well, let me give you some statistics. Let's just take 8, not hundreds.
Okay.
Just 8. If any 8 specific prophecies were fulfilled uniquely and completely in the life of only one man who's ever lived in human history, the odds of that happening, according to Peter Stoner in his book Science Speaks, the odds of that happening are 1 in 10 to the 17th power. That's a 1 with 17 zeros behind it.
Right.
Now, how big of a number is that?
It's big.
Well, it is a big number. Here's how big of a number that is. Let's say you took silver dollars, and you had a slew of them. You guys are in Texas. Let's say we covered the state of Texas 2 feet deep from the Rio Grande to the Red River, from San Jose clear over to Alabama or Louisiana. You covered the whole state of Texas 2 feet deep in silver dollars. That's 10 to the 17th power silver dollars.
Okay.
And let's say you took 1 silver dollar, you spray painted it red, and you airdropped it over the state of Texas somewhere. And then God conveniently set an earthquake to shake the place up a little bit. So you took a guy and you blindfolded him at the Red River up by Dallas, and you shoved him across and said, buddy, you can walk the length and the breadth of the whole state of Texas, but you can only reach down and pick out 1 silver dollar.
Coin.
What are the odds of you getting that coin? The same odds as any one human being in human history uniquely and completely fulfilling 8 of those prophecies.
Right.
And yet there are hundreds of prophecies. Hundreds of prophecies. If only 48 of the prophecies were fulfilled, the odds jump up, and my brain doesn't know what to do with these odds. they jump up to 1 in 10 to the 157th power.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to literally just close your eyes to not pay attention to those kind of details. You know, had a pastor share a story with me of the time he was in Israel, and he spent some time in the house of a Jewish professor there in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And he at one point got bold enough to ask the professor, was Jesus the Messiah? And his response was, well, he was one of many. And he said, well, why would you make that claim? He goes, well, because just like all the rest of them, he failed. And so somehow his, the historical perception of what the Messiah is going to be versus what the prophecy says is going to be, don't line up. And it's an interesting place to be in.
And
well, I think a big question here, and looking at the clock and the time we've got left, we've talked about the fulfilled prophecy and things of that nature, and we kind of touched on it. But Terry, in just a couple of minutes, what are some of the reasons why, evidences where we can say, okay, I believe because of this, Jesus really did rise from the grave?
Well, there's several. Of course, the fulfilled prophecy was only one of the evidences the early Christians used. The other evidence was the eyewitness testimony of the disciples that had lived and studied with Jesus for the 3 years of his earthly ministry. Each one of them claimed that they had personally witnessed, seen, touched, held, eaten with, heard, and watched ascend to heaven the Jesus who had risen from the grave. Now, if that's a lie, we have to ask ourselves the questions, why would they lie?
Right.
Most people only lie to bring about some advantage to themselves.
Right.
But when Jesus' apostles preached this message and claimed to be eyewitnesses of the resurrection, they were excommunicated from Jewish culture. They were imprisoned. They were beaten on numerous occasions. And every one of them was executed. It brought them no monetary gain. It brought them no fame or notoriety that caused them any sort of benefit. It brought them death. And yet, each one of them went to their death, never wavering in their proclamation that Jesus was who he said he was because he had risen from the grave.
And why would somebody do that?
How do you explain that? You know, probably one of the biggest evidences is the conversion of the Apostle Paul, who was a persecutor of Christianity, and yet, while on his way to arrest Christians and bring them back to Jerusalem for execution, he encounters Jesus on his journey, a special revelation of Jesus, and he converts to Christianity and becomes probably the greatest missionary that the church has ever seen. He went on to write nearly half the books of the New Testament. How in the world do you explain the conversion of Saul of Tarsus, somebody that had been trained in the rabbinic tradition and was the hitman for the group that was trying to exterminate Christians, and yet he becomes one of the greatest witnesses to the resurrected Christ that we have. So there are all those witnesses. There's one last witness that is somewhat subjective. It's almost mystical. But hey, I don't have any problem with believing in something mystical. After all, if you can get past the first verse of the Bible, nothing else in the Bible should cause you any trouble. If there really isn't a God who can create the heavens and the earth, nothing else in the book should cause anybody any problem. So God gets the tough stuff out of the way in the very first verse. But it's the ability for the Lord to take lives today and absolutely transform them. Now, that at least has to be admitted as a small piece of evidence. Because
there's something going on there.
There is something going on. Dwight L. Moody was not known to be an overtly scholarly gentleman. He was a great preacher from the end of the 1800s. He founded Moody Bible Institute. He was one time challenged to debate the truth claims of Christianity by the great atheist of the day, Robert Ingersoll. And Moody said, "I will be happy to debate Christianity versus your atheism on one condition. You must bring to the debate hall 100 individuals who were alcoholics, who were criminals, who were down and out derelicts of society, whose lives have been absolutely and radically transformed by your doctrine of atheism, and I will bring 300 people who used to be alcoholics, whose marriages were destroyed, who were on drugs, who were criminals, who were derelicts, who are now productive members of society and whose lives are on fire with excitement and joy because they've been transformed with what I believe. And if you meet those conditions of those conditions, I'll be happy to debate you anytime, anywhere."
See, I never heard that, but that makes sense.
Robert Ingersoll withdrew his appeal for debate because he couldn't find 10.
Well,
now,
why don't we do this?
There's a problem with that philosophy, isn't there?
Yeah.
If Christianity is a lie and atheism is the truth, you would expect the world to shake itself out so that people that believed an absolute lie wouldn't fit into the world that exists.
Right.
And
yeah, and that reminds me of some of the shows, a couple of the shows we did last season on atheism, and you can go back into the archives and find those.
We've got another one coming up soon.
Well, we're talking in 2 weeks. We're talking with Stan Stevens, 30-year atheist, and that will be good. To kind of wind this down and kind of maybe segue into our conclusion, we always give a free resource away at the end of the show. And Terry, why don't you tell us about the one you are recommending and what the connection is to our present discussion?
All righty. Well, the one I'd really like you to give away is Lee Strobel's famous book, The Case for Christ, a journalist personal investigation on the evidence for Jesus. Lee Strobel, let me give you a 1-minute background on who he was. He was an atheist, the legal affairs editor of the Chicago Tribune. Now, I want your listeners to hear that. Not the Hooterville Gazette, not the Smallville Journal, the Chicago Tribune.
Chicago.
Yeah, where do you go in journalism to be bigger than the Chicago Tribune? And legal affairs editor, which means he was a graduate of the University of Missouri School of Journalism, the original and most prestigious school of journalism in the country, and he was a lawyer. He was a trained doctor of jurisprudence. He was an atheist. His wife, to make a long story short, his wife befriended a new family in their neighborhood out in the western suburbs of Chicago. That new family were Christians. The wife started going to church, and Lee Strobel's wife became a Christian. And Strobel said, as long as she didn't make me go to church, I didn't mind. But he said, after 9 months, I came to conclusion, I had a better wife. She was more loving, she was more patient, and I began to question my wife, Strobel said, and she said, well, it's because the difference that the living, resurrected Jesus has made in my life. And he said, I just can't buy that. And she said, I challenge you. And so she gave him a challenge. She said, I challenge you as an investigative reporter and a lawyer to examine the truth claims of Jesus according to the evidence that we have in front of us right now today. And you draw your own conclusions. And Strobel said, well, I couldn't pass that challenge up. And so for about 1.5 years, he examined the evidence for the truth claims of the person of Christ. And he concluded, he writes about this at the beginning of his book, he concluded that he would either have to commit intellectual suicide or accept Christ as Savior. That's how strong he found the evidence for the Christian faith to be. And he accepted Christ as Savior, and went on, believe it or not, to resign being legal affairs editor at the Chicago Tribune, and he went on staff at his home congregation at that time was the Willow Creek Church in South Barrington, Chicago, and became their minister of evangelism. And
Right.
Today, I think he's in Southern California and works with Rick Warren in the Saddleback Church.
Okay.
So that's his story.
Okay, so what we'll do to our audience, if anybody wants the book, Lee Strobel, Case for Christ, we will send it to you. Here's what we're going to do. The first person who either chimes in to our Google Plus page or the Sunday Night Discussions Facebook page or my Facebook page, and they just say, I want the book. We will get your address and pull it up on Amazon, and I will ship it to you. Before we wind down, Terry, you are with Ozark Christian College. If somebody wanted to know more about your story, more about you, or more about your college, or even maybe to support financially what you're doing, how would they go about doing that?
Well, the college pays me my salary, but so we're always thankful for anybody that would like to support the college. They can simply go onto the website that's under my name, Ozark Christian College. You can Google Ozark Christian College or go to www.occ.edu. That will take you to our website, and we have a great website that has all sorts of information from the history of the college to how to contact any of our faculty. We have a wonderful faculty of over 30 full-time faculty and another score of part-time lecturers that are in the business of trying to help young people who are interested in the truth claims of Christ prepare either for full-time Christian vocation or prepare their lives for a lifetime of Christian service in whatever area of study or work they choose to go into.
Okay. Robert, is there anything you have before we pull the plug on our show tonight?
No, I want to thank Terry for being here tonight and spending this time with us. It was a great conversation. What do we got next week?
Next week, we're going to be working with, talking with a gentleman by the name of Lawrence Turner, who works for an organization called Church Development Fund. Lawrence has a banking background, and basically the subject next week is simply going to be God and money. And I know sometimes the skeptical idea is, man, all those churches talk about money. Well, the truth of the matter is, I wonder if we talk about money enough, because we have so many Americans that are so just deeply indebted and enslaved to money. Well, what does God say about money? What does that have to do with our life today and even eternity? So next week, same time, same place, we'll be looking at God and money. Terry, thank you so much for being on the show tonight. If you could wrap everything up in just 2 or 3 sentences, what would you say to the world?
I'd say... let me give you an anecdote. A famous theologian was one time asked, he was a German theologian, his name was Karl Barth. He was asked at the University of Chicago while he was lecturing, Dr. Barth, in all your years of study, what's the greatest truth that you've ever come to know? And Dr. Barth said, oh, that's easy. Here's the greatest theological truth I've ever learned. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so.
Well, Robert, before you pull the plug, can I pray for us?
Please do.
God, thank you for our time tonight, and my God, please take the words that Dr. Bowland has given us. Please use those to encourage the saints and use those to just answer some questions for those who are asking. And I just ask that in Christ's name. Amen.